So today we're going to discuss the unconscious in early Buddhism and how it might be one route towards understanding some notions of personal continuity. It's a deep issue, but I think really interesting. Coming right up. So I'm Doug Smith. I'm study director at the Secular Buddhist Association. That's secularbuddhism.org. If you're new to the channel and interested in living a wiser and a kinder and a calmer life, consider subscribing. So today's topic comes from a question that was asked a while back by Kenneth Grandchamp, who wanted to know how the unconscious might have, appeared in Buddhism. In other words, were there any notions, any ideas of the unconscious that we find in Buddhism, particularly because of the importance that the unconscious has taken in the last, say, 100, 150 years in psychology, where from Freud and others, we have this idea of unconscious mental states underlying our normal tendencies towards our reactions and our opinions and what we do in the world, all of this coming out of sort of hidden unconscious motivations. And in general in Buddhism, the unconscious, or at least aspects that are related to the unconscious, can be seen throughout Buddhist history as coming up in the context of understanding this relation between non-self and karmic consequences. There's a tension between those two concepts, which is a huge topic. I'm just going to paper over it here. I'm just going to give you a very quick introduction to that. Non-self. I have a video on non-self. If you're interested, I'll put it up on the screen here. A big topic. Basically, the idea being that we don't have a permanent essence, an unchanging permanent essence to ourselves that continues from moment to moment that constitutes who we are. Instead, who we are is sort of a constantly changing variety of mental and physical states that come and go over time. So that's non-self. But on the other hand, the Buddha has a very strong idea of karmic consequences, so that when we do something now, we receive the benefit or the harm of that, or some kind of recompense for that in the future. So if we do good actions, we can expect good results in the future. If we do harmful actions, we can expect harm to us in the future. Now, and the question is how to reconcile these two, because in a sense, ethical or karmic justice, if you like, over time, depends upon our having the same person get the result as who did the act. So if we don't have a self, if our self is always changing, how do we make sense of, how do we make a sense of both of those together is basically the idea. And in a broader kind of umbrella, we can ask about, let's say, personality. We know that we have certain kinds of personal traits that reappear in ourselves over time. Whether those be certain kinds of likes and dislikes, or whether those be certain kinds of just sort of innate reactions that we have that always seem to be the same. And how is that the case if we're always changing? In other words, how can we preserve an idea of personality, which is really a kind of sameness over time of the way that we react to the world, like, let's say, always liking chocolate ice cream, or always not liking a certain kind of music, or whatever it might be. These things that seem to not change, although if we really look at it, they actually do change, but just on a slower time scale. But in any event, how can we reconcile that with this notion of constant change that we have with the self in Buddhism, in early Buddhism in particular? And there may be many ways of looking at this, but the one that I find most compelling is the notion of what's called in Pali the Anusayas. That is, these are our underlying tendencies that the Buddha sees in all sentient life, really, but certainly all human life. These are our tendencies towards certain kinds of mental behaviors. If you like, I think the one proper word for this in English would be obsessions. That we have certain kinds of obsessions that we tend to return to over time as humans, as beings with minds who think about things. And in particular, as I recall, there may be different lists of these, but I'm going to take a list of 7 anusayas. And these 7 are first sensual desire, or greed, we can understand it that way. Second is aversion, which is sort of the opposite of sensual desire. Third is views. Fourth is doubt. Fifth is conceit, which is the comparing mind, comparing ourselves to others. Sixth is desire to be reborn. And the seventh is ignorance. And these, for the Buddha, are mental traits that sort of constitute our human personality over time. They're things that recur in every person. They're things that we can find within ourselves. And they're things also which lead to our feeling of unsatisfactoriness, because in the final analysis, all of these anusayas, all of these underlying tendencies, are unskillful to one degree or another. So let's look at them and try to understand them in a little more detail. It's said that the first one, sensual desire, it's said that that underlies positive or pleasant sense states. So when we see something in the world that is pleasant to our eyes or ears or nose or tongue or body or some idea in our mind, when that's pleasant to us, then this underlying tendency towards sense desire or greed arises in the mind. And that's described in more detail as being a feeling of welcoming of the sense desire, of the sensation, a feeling of welcoming, this feeling of approval, this feeling of positive approval of that sensation, and this desire or feeling of wanting to cling to that thing, of wanting to hold to it, of not wanting it to end. So these are all sort of wrapped up in this first one of our tendencies, this first one of our obsessions, which is this kind of sense desire. There's a famous Zen story I remember hearing a while back, where the teacher is going out with his disciple. They go out to a mountaintop. There's a beautiful sunset. They both are looking at it for a while, and then the student, the acolyte, says, "What a beautiful sunset," and the teacher reaches over and whacks him on the head the way they tend to do in Zen stories. And the point of that is that the distinction, supposedly, between the teacher and the student is that the teacher wasn't feeling sense desire at that point. He presumably was aware that this was a pleasant sensation, but he didn't feel the welcoming, the acceptance, the wanting to cling that the student did. And the student then advertised that or affirmed that welcoming by making this exclamation. So insofar as we're really welcoming and relishing in sense desires, we are getting ourselves caught up in this first one of these anusayas, one of these sort of obsessions of the mind. The second one of these underlying tendencies is the underlying tendency to aversion, which, we won't be surprised to hear, occurs when we have painful feelings. And it's described that this aversion is basically our tendency to lament and wail and complain and resist negative, unpleasant feelings. And once again, this kind of aversion is an underlying tendency that happens just sort of normally to all of us. It's a normal human kind of reaction to complain when you're in pain and to resist it and to push it away. But this also is the kind of thing that causes us further suffering. In fact, for the Buddha, this kind of aversion is its own suffering that we lie on top of the pain itself. So the aversion is like, as the Buddha says in a very famous other sutta, a second arrow, where we have the first arrow, which is the physical pain itself. We can't get away from that. But the aversion that we have to the pain then becomes a second arrow that we stick ourselves with, which is a mental kind of pain, which is our lamenting and sorrowing and complaining and resisting and pushing away, all of this kind of effort and energy that we put towards getting the pain out of us, which causes us further pain. Another way that aversion can manifest itself is by attempting to escape pains through pleasant feelings. In other words, we don't feel good for whatever reason, we feel depressed, we feel angry, we feel some kind of suffering, pain, and so we try to, as they say, drown our sorrows in a chocolate ice cream, in alcohol, in some pleasant physical sensation. And of course, we know that in general, that is not a very skillful way to approach things. It can be relatively harmless, obviously, in certain circumstances. We go out for a walk in a nice park or something. That's not obviously hugely problematic, but the point is still the same, which is that what we're doing is distracting ourselves. And distracting ourselves can, in limited circumstances, be skillful, but in the longer term, it's more skillful to actually look at the pain itself and try to deal with the pain on its own terms, rather than simply distracting ourselves all the time, because distracting doesn't actually deal with the source, it only deals with the symptom, if you like. Now, ignorance is the seventh of these underlying tendencies, and in a certain sense, ignorance is the most basic. It's the one that underlies them all, if you like, in a certain way of understanding. But also, in, I think, a sort of more mundane way, ignorance is the one that arises from our neutral sensations. So just like we've seen pleasant sensations lead to a certain kind of clinging, a sense desire, and pains lead to aversion, so neutral sensations lead to ignorance. And that may seem strange to a lot of us. It seemed strange to me when I first heard it. But the point here is that when we are having neutral sensations that don't really disturb us in one way or another, we tend to sort of relax into a kind of dull, if you like, bored kind of disinterest with the world. So instead of directing our minds towards understanding the way the world is, towards trying to get insight into the dangers and their escapes from the dangers in the world, we sort of relax into dullness, if you like. And that is one way of understanding the way that those states can produce a kind of ignorance, a kind of a dull ignorance. And again, these underlying tendencies are just the way that our minds tend to work over and over again. They're tendencies, they're obsessions, if you like. They are part of our personality in a way that all humans sort of share this kind of personality, a sort of common humanity that we have, that we all tend to sort of react the same or similar ways to similar kinds of bodily experiences. Now, the tendency to views is actually quite a deep topic, and one that I can't really get into all of the details here, but basically for the Buddha, one of the ways that we humans tend to react to the world, one of our obsessive ways of reacting, is by building up theories, by building up views, by building up viewpoints, beliefs. And sometimes those can be useful, but usually they're not, and usually they lead to certain kinds of obsessions. And one way that they can lead to obsessions is if they get us into arguments and disputes and anger and hatred and enmity for one another. And one example, a very famous example from the early suttas, occurs in a sutta called the Honeyball Sutta. And here the Buddha is accosted by a rather arrogant Brahmin called Dandapani. And Dandapani, if we read the text nowadays, we don't really see the arrogance there, but in the day, the way that Dandapani approaches the Buddha is clearly one of disdain. He doesn't sit down, he stands up, he's got his staff with him. He's basically looking down on the Buddha, and he asks him in a very direct and sort of indiscreet way, sort of, what is your view? Basically asking him, so what are you teaching? With the implication that the Buddha is an idiot, and he's gonna, Dandapani's gonna figure out what foolish thing he's teaching people. And the Buddha very calmly reacts and says something which is really quite cryptic. And what the Buddha says is, "Sir, my teaching is such that one does not conflict with anyone in this world. And it is such that perceptions do not obsess the person who lives detached from sensual pleasures, without doubting, stripped of worry, and rid of craving for rebirth in this or that state." So what he's saying is he doesn't dispute with anybody. In other words, he doesn't have any views that are disputing with anybody. He's not trying to dispute with Dandapani. In fact, at this point, Dandapani basically rolls his eyes and leaves. Clearly, Dandapani both didn't understand what the Buddha was saying and thought the Buddha was a fool. So, but in fact, the Buddha was saying something really quite deep and arguably deeper than what Dandapani was really looking for. So, but if we read this text, one of the things we'll see is it's cryptic, it's very difficult to understand, but clearly what the Buddha is saying is he's gotten beyond these anusayas, he's gotten beyond these obsessive tendencies the humans have. He says that he's beyond doubt. He says that he is not wanting rebirth. He says that he is doesn't have views to anything in the world. He's detached from sense pleasures and beyond worry. All of these are basically the anusayas that we saw before, these underlying tendencies. So what the Buddha is saying here is that he stays calm. He's not going to get into arguments because he doesn't see views as being the sorts of things that one gets into disputes over, and that he's beyond all of these ordinary tendencies. Now, of course, Dandapani didn't understand that, but now that we're seeing what these anusayas are, we can understand a little bit better what the Buddha might have been getting at there. And the Buddha says that he lives such that perceptions don't obsess the person who lives detached from all of these anusayas, basically. And the point he's making is that when he has perceptions, when he sees things in the world, these tendencies don't arise to obsess his mind. And here, I think it's very important to look at the distinction in early Buddhism between, let's say, higher cognition, that is to say, correct ways of seeing the world, which we might call ordinary cognition. It's sort of the way we see the world when it's not under the control of these anusayas, and what's known as Papañca. Papañca is the proliferating mind. Papañca is a Pali term which is very difficult to translate, and basically it means a proliferating mind, the mind that we normally have, or the proliferations that come up in the mind that we normally have, where these ideas, views, opinions just keep arising and arising and arising. And that is generally due to these underlying tendencies. So when we're under the thrall of sense desire and aversion and viewpoints and doubt and conceit and so on, basically what we're doing is we're constantly trying to construct, if you like, a notion of ourselves in the world, a notion of a self, a notion of a permanent self, because that is also bound up in, let's say, conceit. Conceit, our comparing mind, our seeing ourselves as better or worse or equal to others in certain ways, reifies our notion of ourself, and we try to protect that notion of a self with theories and justifications. I think we all know this, that when something happens that we don't like, and we see ourselves responsible for it, perhaps we come up with justifications trying to protect our sense of self and think of ourselves, protect our notion, a conceited notion that we're better than others, protect that with these views and justifications. And when it comes to views in general, I did an earlier video about 5 ways that we construct a sense of self, which I'll put up on the screen here. And that's also a way that this notion, this idea of the underlying tendency to views is bound up in our notion of self over time. And the last 2 of these underlying tendencies I haven't discussed are doubt and the desire to be reborn. Doubt is clear, we have an underlying tendency to doubt things, and in many circumstances that can be very useful. But for the Buddha, in order to get to awakening, to the end of the path, we have to get beyond doubt. And that's what happens as we get insight. As we get insight into the way things are in the world, then doubt tends to decline because, of course, insight is a sort of a remedy to doubt. And so doubt isn't always bad, and I think doubt can actually be quite useful to us, at least early on in the path, because we're doubting all kinds of things. In fact, we're doubting all kinds of things that are actually not true, so that can be very useful. And finally, the desire to be reborn, this is pretty clearly, transparently, a clinging to the world, and a clinging to our being in the world. And that's part of greed, that's part of self-identity, this notion of being the same person, to be reborn. And I think it's absolutely normal, once again, an absolutely normal, ordinary tendency for humans not to want to die, or to not to want to cease to exist in some whatever fashion we might hold to. And so that desire to be reborn is a very basic kind of tendency within humans, which the Buddha himself believed got us reborn. I mean, that is, of course, the traditional view here, is that that particular underlying tendency, that particular desire, is productive of rebirth, into a future life. And so it's one that we also have to get rid of if we're going to get beyond rebirth, if we're going to get beyond birth and death. So these underlying tendencies play a role somewhat similar to the unconscious in much later Western psychology, because they're tendencies that we don't see. They're not available to our eyes right away. They're not the sorts of things that we're always aware of in our minds, but they're things that persist in a sense of an understanding of persistence over time, in the sense that they keep popping up. They're like seeds, and in the later tradition they'll be described, or at least things will be described with that same term. There are things in the mind that remain there, that are unskillful, and that if we are going to reach to awakening, we're going to have to uproot these tendencies. In fact, that's one of the words the Buddha uses, is that the awakened person is somebody who has uprooted these tendencies, has chopped them into little pieces, burned them, scattered the ashes, and just have nothing to do with them anymore, and that they will never arise again. So it's said that the awakened being does not have any of these underlying tendencies anymore, that they've sort of gotten rid of this aspect of their unconscious, if you like, this sort of last sort of vestige of a personal identity over time that is in fact a kind of ignorance. And so they're left with just the last vestiges of whatever mental states arise in their awakened mind, and then they will not be reborn. That's the traditional view. Now the unconscious, this idea of an unconscious underlying ordinary experience that sort of constitutes our personality and ourselves over time, is one that has a lot of resonance later on in the tradition. I've only talked today about the early tradition, but later on we get notions, very different notions in different Buddhist schools, different in certain ways and not different in others. And it's too much to go into all of them here. It's really quite a deep study to look at these, but I'll just mention them. We have, in the Theravada tradition, we have the idea of the bhavanga, which is a kind of an underlying mental state that is there when other mental states are not there, and that is constituted by the facts about our rebirth, certain facts about our prior lifetime, about our karmic baggage, and that sort of underlying tendency, but a sort of a basic kind of underlying tendency that sort of underlies everything. That's something we find called the bhavanga, again, in Theravada. In other traditions, we get a notion of karmic seeds that are lain down over time, called bīja. Bīja is I believe it's a Sanskrit term. It might also be in Pali. Then later on, still, we get the idea of what's called the Alaya vijñana, which is what's called the storehouse consciousness, or the house consciousness, which is basically a kind of a storehouse that holds the karmic seeds, so that there's a part of the mind which retains the seeds laid down by our prior karmic actions, if you like. Because, of course, there was this idea of, well, if there's no personal continuity, if I'm not the same person now as I was a minute ago, what happens with karmic consequences? I mean, things that I did a long time ago that are good or bad. Well, those lay seeds in the mind. The seeds then are in a part of the mind called the Alaya vijñana, this storehouse consciousness, which is a kind of unconscious mind, that then these seeds sprout into the conscious mind, perhaps causing us pain within our ideas, causing us obsessions, causing us all kinds of mischief, basically, if we've done bad things, and the opposite if we've done good things. And finally, I would say the one other way of dealing with the problem is by the Sarvastivāda school, which holds that that all times are equally real, and so the past is just as real as the future, is just as real as the present, and so therefore past karmic events can have a present effect because they're still real. And this is, I guess, a little bit farther away from actual unconsciousness, except that the mind is sort of always present in the three times. But all these are ways of saying that there are parts of the mind that are not directly available to us, but that interact with ourselves in our daily lives over time in similar ways. And so as a result, causing us to have certain kinds of personality quirks, or at least ways that our personality remains somewhat similar. A couple of words about practice. How do we practice with this? And I think one of the ways that we can at least approach practice is to be aware of these underlying tendencies, these anusayas, as I called them, or as they're called in Pali. And to be aware of them, and to be aware that part of wisdom, part of the approach towards wisdom that we take in practice, part of the approach towards calm and lack of stress that we have in practice, is to try to uproot these slowly over time. These are tendencies that have very, very deep and extensive root systems, if we like, taking that same metaphor. Deep and extensive root systems, and so it takes a very long time to uproot them if we ever can completely do so. But to be aware of the problems. These are 7 that the Buddha saw that are latent in all of us. So if this talk has been useful, give it a thumbs up. If you're new to the channel, consider subscribing. And if you're a long-time viewer, check out Patreon, you might be interested. So thanks so much, and I hope we'll catch you on the next one of these videos. Meanwhile, be well.